One, two, three. Hello, everyone. I don't know if this is episode 2 or episode 3 of our crash course on the 160th anniversary of the coolest period of time in the American Civil War, but we're going to talk about
JBH.
Jean Bell Hood.
It's nice when you put a little French Jean Bell Hood. I don't know. That works. Anyways.
Jean Bell Hood. How about that?
That works. That's good.
How about John Bell Hood?
That also works.
How about John Bell Hood? Which
like,
sounds...
like the guy who played Fremantle in Gettysburg. Yeah,
oh my God.
Yeah.
I don't even have a little cup. I'll flip this upside down. Well, General Longstreet.
Very cavalier. Which is a good word to describe John Bell Hood. Cavalier. That works.
Yes, Cavalier. The Bold Cavalier. Isn't that a book from like 1950?
Yeah.
Yeah.
About Stewart.
You know, John Bell Hood is...
Bold Dragoon. That was it.
Bold Dragoon. That makes me think of Jeb Stewart.
Why do I know that? Yeah, anyways.
You know, John Bell Hood has long fascinated me. Do you know why I started liking Hood? Because I couldn't stand Gettysburg. I couldn't. Let me rephrase that. I couldn't stand the people who incessantly talked about Gettysburg. But ironically, it led me to learn about Hood.
Yeah.
And Gaines Mill, and Second Manassas, and Antietam, and then, of course, he's wounded on the second day at the fabled fields of Gettysburg. But then I traveled to Tennessee.
Yeah.
And John Bell Hood was a drunken, loser, knucklehead.
Yeah. See, you had a very different approach. See,
failed lover.
Hood was what brought me to Franklin. Because as I started to learn more about him, everybody said, well, he was great right up until Franklin.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I got to figure out what happened in Franklin.
Yeah.
But there is, so you hated Gettysburg.
I didn't hate Gettysburg.
You hated the movie. You hated Hood in the movie Gettysburg.
That's terrible. That's so terrible. He's so old. We should have
a nice guy, though.
We should have gone around to the right.
I got into Hood largely because when I
Patrick
was little,
Gorman, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice enough guy, Too old for the role. That's besides the point. I got into Hood through Sam Hood. Growing up in New Orleans, knowing Sam. Went by the house that he lived in right up till his death.
Oh, it's such a great part of New Orleans.
And then the cemetery, too. Both of them. Lafayette and Metairie Cemetery, where he's buried now. But that's what got me interested and got the bite. And then got up here and then really had to figure out, was he on laudanum? Was he angry at all of his generals? Did he really get mad at Forrest and Cheatham?
When I visited the first time Tennessee, because I'd been to Virginia, I'd been to Georgia. Tennessee was something totally different. Mm-hmm. It was seriously like Monty Python kind of comedy. It was just so ludicrous. What I heard about Hood and what it did was challenge me to research, to find what I could, and it was, the Gallant Hood and the Bold Cavalier, whatever was out there, McMurray's book, and of course,
still say the best,
pretty darn good. And I did realize that there was the Joe Johnston sycophants and their little fan club, and they and Hood. The anti-Hood fan club really worked well together. Yeah. And I'm pretty proud of the work that's been done around this area, and not just by us, but we have led the way in trying to give Hood his just due.
So who is he? What's his? I mean, he comes out of Kentucky.
You know
what
he
gone medical route, went to the Army instead.
You know what he was? He's kind of a badass.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm glad you said it.
He really is. Here's a guy who went to West Point, and he was in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, right?
Wounded.
Almost killed by Comanche Indians at Devil's Run out in Texas. Survives that. he joins the Confederate effort, I think, because he just identified, to use a very modern vernacular,
With the Texans,
he
yeah.
identified as a Southerner. I mean, his state didn't secede, so what's his excuse? I do think it's fair to say that Hood was one of those people that George Wagner thought had considered treason. You know, he walked away from his oath. But that aside, for the purposes of this discussion, he's all in.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, Hood had something that you couldn't teach. He had instinct, he had charisma, and he had commitment.
Yeah.
And just
and he makes his name early.
Go to Gaines Mill.
super early.
Go to Gaines Mill.
Yeah.
That is the worst battlefield I have ever been at as far as terrain. It is god-awful. Kennesaw is bad, but Gaines Mill is down into a swamp and
then
out.
back up. Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
And, then it's Second Manassas, then it's Antietam, as I said earlier. I sat with Sam Hood, and when the papers were found, Sam had found all of Hood's papers, and someone asked a question. And I said, here's my take. On July 17th, 1864, I don't care that he was missing a right leg. His left arm, we now know, had almost recovered by the time of the Battle of Chickamauga. On July 17th, 1864, when he took command of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, which had been led by Johnston, dead, Beauregard, failed, Bragg, failed, Johnston, failed. Okay? When Hood took command, there was nobody that had a resume any better than his. Okay? He had been a corps commander, a division commander, a brigade commander. He had led gallantly. He had certainly paid a price. He was as good as Pat Claiborne and had commanded more troops than Claiborne ever has. You're not going to put Forrest in charge. You wouldn't put him in charge of an army, period. You wouldn't put Jeb Stuart in charge.
Yeah.
Hood's the guy. The problem is, it isn't that he's 33. It's that he just never should have been an army commander. Corps command may have even been one step too high. He's really good. He's the guy on the battlefield. If I want to take that position,
He's going to go and do it himself.
It's like the point of the spear.
Yep.
But not everybody should be in charge. But at that point, Jeff Davis had to make a choice, and we can second guess this till Sunday.
Yeah.
He made the choice. He had the resume, and he did everything that I think anybody else could have.
Yeah, there's nobody that can sit back now 160 years later and say, well, Hood should have done this and should have tried this and should have tried this.
He tried it.
He tried all of the options. Everything that you throw forward, he considered it.
This is where I get to say it. And anybody out there who's like, if you're in the Sons of Confederate Veterans or you're really into the Confederate, yeah. I'll tell you what. You know what Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson did every single time they got a chance, except Fredericksburg? They attacked. They got after the enemy. That's what Alexander the Great did. That's what Napoleon did. That's what Caesar did. That's what Patton did. That's what Grant did.
That's what John Bell Hood did.
That's what John Bell Hood did. And he'd learned it. I mean, Robert E. Lee that's what Forrest did for the most part.
Yeah.
Robert E. Lee was a great general. Not just because he went to West Point and, didn't have a lot of demerits. It's because he went out and kicked the crap out of the enemy.
Yeah.
And Hood learned that. And I've never...
I would like to just point out real quick that Eric Jacobson, the man from Minnesota, just said that Robert E. Lee was a great general.
He is a great general.
I know. I just want to put it on the record.
He's a great general. It's like we're doing
That should have come
it's
from
like we're
me.
doing a
It came from
PSA.
you.
It's like we're doing a PSA for John Bell Hood or Confederate officers. But he was good, and I've never understood the people who criticize someone who tried, because part of me wants to say, well, then why don't you get in a game?
Yeah. Hop in the saddle.
Right.
Lose a leg. Try it out.
I mean, why don't you run a business? Why
Yeah.
don't you take a chance on something? Why don't
Yeah.
you move across the country, write a book?
Yeah.
Why don't you do something other than criticize all the time?
Yeah.
And Hood, you know what I also like about Hood? Because you asked who he was? He wasn't a baby. You know, he kind of had a few baby letters with Sherman. But when the war
In the
was
name of God and
when
humanity.
when the war was over,
Yeah. He moved on. He
said,
realized we were defeated and he moved on.
we tried, we lost.
Yep.
And he tried to live out his life in in relative peace with his wife and kids in New Orleans. Gets dragged into the fight, the fight with the pen by Johnston. But there's no way you can, I think, fully appreciate Spring Hill and Franklin and Nashville without talking about JBH.
Feels like that's a pretty good way to end it.
Is that a good way to end
I
it?
feel like that's a good way to end it.
Well, we've got more than JBH because we've got his counterpart probably in either next week's episode or the one after. So, John McAllister Schofield up next.